Wind screamed across the Montana plain, hurling ice like shards of glass. Silas Grant saw only the endless white prison of winter, until a stumble in the snow resolved into a figure, crumpled and dark against the blinding drifts. A desperate whisper cut through the gale, raw and thin as frayed rope. "Mister, please, can I give birth in your cabin?" Her eyes held the terror of the hunted. He hesitated, the ghost of his own past screaming, "Stay alone." Then, gruffly, "Get in." The axe bit deep into the frozen heart of the log, the thwack echoing dully in the muffled silence of the late afternoon. Silas Grant straightened, a plume of breath fogging the biting air before vanishing. He scanned the horizon, a ritual born of habit and hardened by years of solitude. To the east, the ragged teeth of the Absaroka Mountains bit into a leaden sky. Everywhere else, the rolling plains of Montana lay buried under a crushing weight of snow. Winter wasn't just a season here, it was a siege, and Silas was its sole weary defender. His cabin, a low-slung structure of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and stubbornness, hunched against the relentless wind. Smoke curled thinly from its stone chimney, a fragile defiance against the encroaching cold. Inside, it was little more than shelter: a cot, a pot-bellied stove radiating meager heat, a scarred table, and walls hung with the practical tools of survival. Traps, a worn saddle, his Winchester .73 leaning near the door. The air smelled of wood smoke, cured leather, and the profound emptiness of a life pared down to necessity. 10 years, 10 winters. Since the war had spat him out, hollowed and branded, since the fever took Martha and little Ben in that stinking Memphis infirmary, while he'd been off chasing ghosts in gray uniforms. Pine Hollow, 50 hard miles south, held only judgment and the memory of his failure. The wilderness offered silence, a brutal kind of absolution, or so he'd told himself. He hauled the split wood into the lean-to beside the cabin, stacking it meticulously. Routine was the mortar holding his fragile piece together. Feed the stove, tend the single stoic mare, Bess, sheltered in the small barn, melt snow for water, watch the endless white, think as little as possible. The memories were wolves at the door, best kept outside. Sometimes, though, they slipped in, the acrid tang of gunpowder thick in Virginia humidity, the way Martha's laugh used to chime like a bell across their Tennessee farmyard before the war, the terrifying stillness of Ben's small fever-ravaged face. He'd been a sharpshooter, efficient, detached, until detachment became impossible, replaced by a guilt that clung like swamp mud. Out here, the only thing he aimed at was survival. He was securing the barn door against the rising wind when he saw it, a dark smudge against the pristine sweep of snow leading down from the northern ridge. Too big for a wolf, too irregular for a bush. Silas squinted, the cold gnawing through his thick wool coat and buffalo hide gloves. The wind snatched his breath away. Movement, faint, unsteady, a stumble. Then the smudge resolved into a shape, human, bent double, staggering against the brutal force of the gale. Silas didn't move immediately. Strangers meant trouble, always. Could be a trapper lost, could be someone worse. His hand instinctively brushed the cold butt of the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. The figure lurched closer, collapsing into a drift not 50 yards from the barn. A cry, thin and desperate, was torn away by the wind. He saw then the bulkiness of the figure, the awkward way they tried to rise. Not a man, a woman, cursing under his breath, the old wariness warring with a reluctant pull of obligation. Silas pushed away from the barn and trudged towards the fallen shape. The snow was deep, crusted in places, treacherously soft in others. Each step was an effort. As he neared, the details sharpened through the swirling snow. A woman, young, her face pale as death beneath a woolen scarf pulled high, her eyes wide with a terror that went beyond the cold. She wore a man's heavy coat, far too large, patched and threadbare, the hem ragged and soaked. Her boots were inadequate, cloth wrapped around them in a futile attempt at insulation. But it was the impossible swell beneath the layers of coat and rough homespun dress that froze Silas mid-stride. She was heavily, desperately pregnant. She scrabbled backwards in the snow as he approached, a low whimper escaping her chapped lips. Fear radiated from her like heat from the stove. She looked half-starved, exhaustion etching deep lines around her eyes. A bruise, livid purple and yellow, bloomed across her left cheekbone. Her gaze darted past him, towards the darkening expanse she'd come from, then back to his face, searching, pleading. Silas stopped a few feet away, his own breath loud in the sudden lull of wind. "Lady," he called, his voice rusty from disuse, "you're gonna freeze solid out here." She didn't speak for a long moment, just stared at him, her chest heaving. Tears, instantly chilled, traced paths through the grime on her cheeks. When her voice finally came, it was a raw scrape, barely audible over the returning moan of the wind, yet it carried a terrifying urgency. Please," she whispered, the word dissolving into a cough that racked her frame. She clutched her swollen belly, her face contorted not just with cold, but with a sudden sharp pain. Her eyes, enormous and dark with panic, locked onto his. "Mister, please, can I give birth in your cabin?" The question hung in the frozen air, absurd and terrifying. Silas recoiled inwardly. Birth? Here? Now? In his Spartan refuge, a place untouched by life, only haunted by death. The sheer vulnerability of her, the monumental need, was an avalanche threatening to bury his carefully constructed isolation. He saw Martha, sweating and crying out in their Tennessee bedroom, the midwife's grim face. He saw the tiny still bundle, wrapped in a clean blanket, failure, helplessness, pain he'd walled off behind miles of wilderness and years of silence. He looked down at her, shivering violently in the snowdrift, her terror mixed with a fierce, animal determination to protect the life within her. He looked towards his cabin, a dim beacon in the gathering twilight. He looked back north, the direction she'd fled. The wind howled, carrying with it the promise of a killing night. Bringing her in meant chaos, danger, the shattering of his fragile peace. Leaving her meant death. 2 deaths. The wariness, the ingrained instinct for self-preservation, screamed a warning. But deeper, older instincts stirred, remnants of decency, echoes of a man he thought the war had killed. The sight of her bruise, the sheer desperation in her whisper, pricked something long dormant. His jaw tightened. The ghosts whispered louder, but the living woman shivering at his feet was undeniable. A gust of wind nearly knocked her sideways. Time was a luxury she didn't have. The cold was a visible predator now, stealing the color from her lips, deepening the shadows under her eyes. The decision, when it came, wasn't reasoned. It was visceral, pulled from some buried well of humanity he'd thought dry. He stepped forward, his movements stiff. Without a word, he bent, slipping one arm under her shoulders, the other beneath her knees. She was lighter than he expected, a bundle of bones and desperate life beneath the layers. She gasped, whether from pain, fear or surprise, he couldn't tell. Her body tensed, then went limp, surrendering to exhaustion, or the faint hope his actions offered. "Hold on," he muttered, the words rough gravel in his throat. He lifted her, the effort sent a twinge through his old shoulder wound, a souvenir from Petersburg. He turned, staggering slightly under her weight and the uneven snow, and began the arduous trudge back towards the cabin. She buried her face against the rough wool of his coat, her breath coming in shallow, pained gasps. He kicked the cabin door open, the warmth inside hitting them like a physical wall after the killing cold. He carried her straight to the cot near the stove, lowering her as gently as his numb hands allowed. She sank into the thin mattress with a groan, her eyes fluttering closed for a second before snapping open, wide with renewed fear, scanning the shadowed corners of the unfamiliar room. Silas straightened, feeling awkward, enormous in the small space, suddenly filled with her vulnerability. He moved to the stove, added another split log. The fire crackled, casting jumping shadows on the walls. He filled a tin cup with water from the pot warming on the stove's surface, and brought it to her. "Drink," he said, holding it out. Slow, she pushed herself up on trembling arms, took the cup with both hands, gulping the warm water greedily, spilling some down her chin. Her eyes never left his face, wary as a cornered doe. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice slightly stronger, though still thready. "I didn't know where else to go. They're coming." The last words were barely audible, choked with fresh terror. Silas froze, the cup halfway back to the stove. "They're coming." The words landed like stones in the quiet cabin, shattering the fragile moment of respite. His gaze snapped to the small, ice-rimed window. The world outside was a swirling gray void, but the threat she named felt suddenly, horrifyingly tangible. Who? How close? The isolation that had been his shield now felt like a trap. He looked back at the woman, Elara. She'd called herself when he'd gruffly asked her name moments before lifting her. Her face was etched with pure dread. She wasn't just fleeing the cold, she was running for her life, and she'd brought the storm right to his door. The wind outside seemed to rise in pitch, a mournful wail that sounded chillingly like pursuit. The words "they're coming" hung in the cabin's close air, colder than the drafts seeping through the chinking. Silas slowly lowered the tin cup back onto the stove's iron surface, the metal clicking softly. He turned, his movements deliberate, his gaze fixed on Elara. Her eyes, wide and dark as forest pools reflecting storm clouds, held pure terror. It wasn't just fear of the wilderness, it was the hunted kind, sharp and immediate. "Who?" Silas asked, his voice low, roughened by disuse and the sudden tension coiling in his gut. He kept his distance near the Winchester, leaning by the door. Elara shivered violently, pulling the thin blanket Silas had draped over her tighter around her swollen form. She looked away towards the small ice-furred window, as if expecting faces to materialize in the swirling gray dusk. "Men," she whispered, the word catching, "from Pine Hollow." She hesitated, her hand instinctively cradling her belly as another wave of discomfort, sharper this time, tightened her features. "He sent them. Caleb. Caleb." The name landed with weight, a man's name. Not a vague, "they." Silas filed it away. Pine Hollow. 50 miles south, a place of hard faces and harder judgments, a place that had offered him only sideways glances and muttered suspicions when he'd first arrived. A broken man. He knew its type. Sent them for what? He pressed, his hand resting lightly on the Winchester's stock. The familiar cold wood was a comfort, a reminder of a skill he'd rather forget but couldn't afford to. Elara flinched at his directness. Her gaze darted back to him, searching his face for condemnation, finding only guarded intensity. "The child," she breathed, her voice barely audible above the wind's mournful howl. "He says it's his property." A flicker of defiance sparked in her eyes, quickly smothered by fear. "It's not anymore, not ever truly. Caleb. He's not a man to be denied." She swallowed hard, a visible effort. "He has influence. In Pine Hollow, and beyond. He'll pay men to track a runaway dog, let alone." Her voice trailed off, her meaning chillingly clear. Property. The word curdled in Silas's stomach. He'd seen men treat others as property before, under different flags, in different kinds of hell. The memory, the acrid smell of burning Georgia pine, the desperate cries of men caught in crossfire he'd helped orchestrate, threatened to surface. He shoved it down, focusing on the woman before him, the tangible threat. A powerful man from Pine Hollow, hunting a woman he claimed was his, hunting the child she carried. It explained the bruise, the desperation, the flight into the teeth of a Montana winter. It spelled trouble he didn't need, couldn't afford. Silas moved away from the door, not towards Elara, but towards the small window. He rubbed a patch of frost clear with the heel of his hand, peering out. The world was a monochrome blur of driving snow and deepening shadows. Visibility was shrinking by the minute. Good for hiding, bad for seeing what approached. His mind raced, assessing the meager defenses. The cabin was sturdy enough against the elements, but against determined men with guns, it was a box. A trap. He thought of Martha, feverish in their Tennessee cabin, Ben crying weakly in the next room while he'd been away, useless, mustering for a war that would take everything. The helplessness he'd felt then, echoed now, a cold dread beneath the surface tension. He turned back. Elara was watching him, her fear now mixed with a profound weariness that seemed to seep into her bones. "I'm sorry," she whispered, fresh tears welling. "I didn't mean, I saw your smoke. It was the only light." The apology, the sheer burden of guilt in her voice, pricked at the wall he'd built. It wasn't her fault. Caleb was a monster. It wasn't her fault. Silas was the only soul for miles. "Ain't your fault the world's full of bastards." Silas grunted, the words surprising even him. He busied himself, adding another log to the stove, the fire crackling defiance against the cold pressing in. How long ago did you leave Pine Hollow?" 3 days ago, Elara said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "Walked mostly, hid during the day, near the creek bluffs, walked at night, took a horse, borrowed one, from the livery, but it went lame yesterday morning. I had to leave it." She shuddered. "I don't know how many he sent. Maybe 2, 3, men who don't ask questions when Caleb Bishop pays." Bishop, the surname now attached to the threat. "They're hard men, used to tracking. 3 days, on foot, pregnant. In this weather." Silas felt a grudging flicker of respect beneath the alarm. She had grit. This Elara. He glanced at the darkening window again. 3 days meant they could be close, very close, especially if they had horses that hadn't gone lame. The wind seemed to carry a new note now. Not just mourning, but menace. "You need food," he stated, turning practical. Worry wouldn't stop bullets. He moved to a rough cupboard, pulling out a strip of venison jerky and a hard biscuit. He brought them to her, along with a fresh cup of water. "Eat, slow." She took the offering with trembling hands, nibbling at the jerky, with a desperation that spoke of days without proper sustenance. Silas watched her, the way the firelight softened the harsh angles fear had carved on her young face. He noticed her hands, surprisingly graceful despite the chapped skin and raw knuckles, as she carefully broke off a piece of biscuit. A sudden, unbidden memory surfaced. Martha's hands, deftly stitching a quilt, humming softly. The pang was sharp, unexpected. He turned away abruptly, busying himself with checking the load in his Colt Peacemaker, the metallic snick of the cylinder, loud in the quiet cabin. "You fought in the war?" Elara asked softly, between bites, her eyes on the revolver in his hands. Silas froze, the familiar weight of the Colt suddenly heavier. "Yeah," he rasped, not looking at her. "Long time ago." "Which side?" There was no judgment in her voice, only a quiet curiosity born of shared hardship. "Does it matter now?" he countered, his voice tighter than he intended. He holstered the Colt, the movement final. The ghosts stirred, the crack of his Sharps rifle, the distant thud of a falling body, the endless, muddy march. He pushed them back. This was now, this cabin, this woman, this threat. He moved to the door, lifted the heavy wooden bar, and dropped it into the brackets with a solid thunk. The sound was final, sealing them in. He checked the shutters on the single window, ensuring the thick wooden slats were secure. Each action was methodical, born of ingrained caution. He felt Elara's eyes on him, a mixture of gratitude and renewed anxiety. "They won't stop," she whispered, the jerky forgotten in her hand. "Caleb, he gets what he wants, always." Silas didn't answer immediately. He picked up the Winchester, running a calloused thumb over the worn wood of the stock. The smooth grain felt like an old friend, a deadly one. He peered again through the small clear patch on the window. The snow was falling thicker now, a swirling curtain, good for cover, bad for seeing. The wind howled like a pack of wolves circling. Wolves, the image stuck. Hunters, closing in. He turned back to the room, his gaze sweeping over the vulnerable woman on the cot, the meager fire, the weapons that felt suddenly insufficient. The cabin, his refuge, felt stifling, charged with impending violence. The weight of responsibility settled on him, heavier than any pack he'd carried during the war. He hadn't asked for this, he'd chosen solitude, yet here he was. "Then we make it hard for them," Silas said, his voice a low growl that matched the wind outside. It wasn't reassurance, it was a grim statement of fact. He moved to blow out the single oil lamp, plunging the cabin into near darkness. lit only by the flickering orange glow from the stove's grate. Shadows leaped and danced on the walls, monstrous and shifting. In the sudden gloom, every creak of the settling logs, every moan of the wind, became a potential footfall, a signal. They sat in tense silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire, the wind's relentless assault, and Alara's shallow, frightened breathing. Silas stationed himself near the shuttered window, Winchester resting across his knees, his ears straining against the storm's cacophony. Minutes stretched into an hour, the tension a living thing coiling tighter in the cramped space. Alara shifted, a small gasp escaping her as another contraction gripped her. Silas tensed, his finger brushing the Winchester's trigger guard. Then, cutting through the wind's wail like a knife, came a sound that froze the blood in Silas's veins. Not the cry of a coyote, not the groan of timber. It was the sharp, unmistakable whinny of a horse, close, too close, followed instantly by a gruff, muffled shout, swallowed almost immediately by the storm, but undeniably human, directly outside the barn. The horse's whinny, sharp and terrified, sliced through the cabin's fragile silence, followed by the gruff shout, "Easy there," swallowed almost instantly by the blizzard's roar. Close, too close. Near the barn where Bess, Silas's mare, was stabled, Silas was already moving. The Winchester came up smoothly. Instinctively, his body coiled like a spring released. He pressed himself flat against the log wall beside the shuttered window, ears straining against the wood. Outside, the wind shrieked and moaned, a chaotic orchestra masking any further distinct sounds. But the damage was done. The fragile illusion of time, of distance, was shattered. They were here, now. On the cot, Alara gasped, a sound choked with pure terror. Her hands flew to her swollen belly, her eyes wide and fixed on Silas, mirroring his own coiled tension. "They found us," she breathed, the words barely audible, thick with despair. Silas didn't answer. His focus was absolute, narrowed to the storm outside, and the potential breach. Leaving her unprotected in the dark cabin felt like abandoning a post, but knowing what was out there was critical. Bess's safety mattered too. Without the mare, escape, if it came to that, was impossible. "Stay down," he hissed, his voice a low rasp. "Don't make a sound." He saw her nod frantically in the dim, flickering light from the stove grate, pulling the thin blanket over her head like a shroud. Her fear was a palpable thing, thick in the close air. Moving with the silent precision honed in countless night patrols, Silas eased the heavy wooden bar from the door brackets. The scrape of wood on wood sounded deafening in the tense stillness. He inched the door open just enough to slip through, the icy wind and driven snow immediately clawing at him, stealing his breath. He pulled the door shut behind him, leaving it unbarred for a swift retreat, the cold a brutal shock after the cabin's meager warmth. The world was a swirling white hell. Visibility was down to a few yards, the snow stinging his face like needles. He kept low, using the bulk of the cabin as cover, his boots crunching softly on the wind-packed snow. The barn stood a dark, hulking shape 20 paces away. He could hear Bess now, a nervous stomping and a low, frightened nicker coming from within. Not the sounds of a horse alone. He reached the side of the barn, pressing his back against the rough, snow-crusted logs, listening. Above the wind's howl, he caught it. Muffled voices arguing. 2, maybe 3 men. Close, just around the corner near the barn door. "Fool beast near kicked my head off," one voice snarled, thick with irritation. "Shoulda tied it proper outside, 'stead of bustin' in here," another countered, higher pitched, tense. "Place is warmer, but now we're trapped with it. Door latch is busted clean off. Quit your yappin'. Found her horse lame back a ways. She's here. Cabin's gotta be close. Saw smoke earlier, before this damnable blow." Silas's blood ran cold. They'd found Alara's abandoned horse. They knew she was here, and they'd forced their way into his barn, likely startling Bess and breaking the latch in the process. They were pinned down for the moment, arguing over the horse, shielded from the worst of the storm, but they were mere yards from the cabin, from Alara. Waiting out the blizzard's peak, gathering their nerve, he edged along the barn wall, risking a glance around the corner towards the door. It hung slightly ajar, snow already drifting inside. He saw a glimpse of movement within the dark interior, a bulky shadow near Bess's stall. He couldn't risk a shot, not without a clear target, and with Bess in the line of fire. Retreat was the only option, back to the cabin, fortify, wait. He moved silently back, the wind now at his back, pushing him towards the cabin door. He slipped inside, slamming the bar home with a solid thunk that echoed in the small space. He leaned against the door for a moment, breathing hard, shaking snow from his coat and hat. The warmth felt cloying now, thick with fear. Elara pushed the blanket down, her face pale as milk in the gloom. "They're in the barn?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Silas nodded, moving to the window, rubbing a fresh patch clear. The barn was just a darker smudge in the white chaos. 2, maybe 3, arguing over Bess, broke the latch getting in. He turned to her, his expression grim. "They're waiting out the worst of it. They know you're here." A low moan escaped Elara, part fear, part pain as another contraction visibly tightened her body. She screwed her eyes shut, breathing in short, sharp gasps. When it passed, she looked at Silas, her eyes enormous. "Caleb, he sends men like Judd Ricker, big, mean, doesn't care about anything but the money, and hurting people." She shuddered. He used to brag about the men he hired, outlaws, men with no lines they wouldn't cross. Silas absorbed this. Judd Ricker, another name for the faceless threat. Men without lines, the kind who'd drag a pregnant woman back through a blizzard for coin, or worse. He thought of the men he'd faced in the war, some honorable, many not. The worst were always the ones who enjoyed the cruelty. A memory flashed, unbidden. A burning farmhouse in the Shenandoah Valley, a Confederate sergeant, laughing as he kicked over a milk pail, while a woman wept. Silas had put a bullet in that man's skull from 300 yards, the cleanest shot he'd ever made. The image faded, replaced by Elara's terrified face. Different kind of war, same kind of bastard. He moved to the table, picking up his Colt Peacemaker. He checked the load again, the metallic clicks precise in the tense quiet. Then, an impulse struck him. He grabbed a spare cylinder, already loaded, and a cloth, and walked over to the cot. "Here," he said, his voice gruff, but lacking its usual harsh edge. He placed the loaded cylinder and the cloth on the blanket beside her. "If things get bad inside, if I can't," he trailed off, unable to voice the possibility of being overrun. "The cylinder pops out here." He pointed to the latch. "You wipe the old one out quick, shove this new one in, twist it home, point, pull the hammer back, then the trigger, understand?" He demonstrated the motions slowly in the air. Elara stared at the cold metal, then up at him. Her fear was still there, but beneath it, a spark of something else, determination, perhaps, or a fierce protective anger for the life inside her. She reached out a trembling hand, not touching the cylinder, but hovering near it. "I understand," she whispered. "Point, pull hammer, trigger." Her gaze met his. "Thank you, Silas." He gave a curt nod, a strange tightness in his chest. He hadn't protected Martha. He hadn't saved Ben. This felt like a last, desperate stand against the same crushing tide of helplessness. He returned to the window, Winchester ready. Time crawled. The storm raged unabated, a furious white wall pressing against the cabin. The wind found every tiny crevice, whistling a mournful, threatening tune. Silas stood sentinel, his body aching with tension, his senses stretched thin trying to filter human sounds from the storm's chaos. Elara lay still, but her breathing was uneven, punctuated by soft gasps as contractions came with increasing frequency. The air grew thick with the shared weight of waiting dread. Then, Elara stirred. A low, soft sound began to emanate from her, almost lost under the wind's howl. A hum, fragile, tremulous, but distinct. A melody Silas half recognized, something old and sorrowful. Lorena, the tune of lost love and longing drifted through the dark cabin, a fragile thread of humanity against the encroaching brutality. Silas didn't turn, but he listened, the haunting notes weaving through his own memories of loss, a shared lament in the suffocating dark. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the wind's wail, and Alara's fragile song, not a shout, not a whinny, a sharp splintering crack from the direction of the barn, like wood breaking under force. Then, a moment later, the distinct heavy thud of the barn door being slammed shut hard against its frame. Secured from the inside, Silas's grip tightened on the Winchester. They weren't just waiting out the storm anymore. They were settling in, fortifying their position, making a plan. The storm still raged, but the fragile barrier of weather wouldn't hold them forever. The pressure in the cabin intensified, a vise tightening. Alara's humming stopped abruptly. She pushed herself up on one elbow, her face contorted not just with fear, but with a new, sharper agony. Her breath hitched, then came out in a long, low groan that had nothing to do with terror. Her free hand clutched at the blanket, knuckles white. She looked at Silas, her eyes wide with a different kind of panic, raw and primal. "Silas," her voice was a ragged whisper, strained beyond terror. "It's happening, now." The words "it's happening, now," hung in the frigid air, charged with a primal urgency that momentarily eclipsed the threat lurking in the barn. Alara's groan wasn't just pain, it was the sound of inevitability crashing through the fragile barricade of fear. Her body arched, hands clawing at the thin blanket, her face a mask of concentration and terror. Silas stood frozen for a heartbeat, the Winchester suddenly forgotten in his hands. The icy dread of the men outside warred violently with the immediate visceral reality unfolding on his cot. Birth. Life forcing its way into a world of snow and violence. He hadn't delivered a baby. He'd only witnessed Martha's, a chaotic, blood-streaked memory ending in silence and grief. Failure choked him. Another groan, sharper, tore from Alara's throat. Her eyes flew open, locking onto his with desperate intensity. "Silas, help me." It was a command, a plea, shorn of any pretense. Action replaced paralysis. He shoved the Winchester into the corner near the door, within easy reach. The cabin felt smaller, hotter, the air thick with wood smoke and rising panic. He moved to the stove, grabbing the pot of warming water. "Need more water, hot," he muttered. More to himself than her, his voice tight. He scooped snow from just inside the door, refilling the pot, his movements jerky but purposeful. He added another log, stoking the fire until flames licked hungrily at the iron belly, casting frantic, leaping shadows on the walls. Light, heat, cleanliness. These were the things he vaguely remembered mattered. He found a relatively clean cloth, dunking it into the warming water, wringing it out. He hesitated near the cot, the intimacy of the act warring with his ingrained reserve. Alara gasped, her breath coming in short, sharp pants. "Breathe," he rasped, the word unfamiliar on his tongue. He recalled the midwife's firm, calm voice in Tennessee. Like, blowing out a candle. Slow. He clumsily mimed the action. Alara tried, her eyes screwed shut, sweat beading on her pale forehead despite the cold drafts. She managed a shaky exhalation as the contraction peaked, then subsided. She sagged back, panting, her gaze finding his, a flicker of something, not gratitude, but perhaps recognition of his effort, passed between them. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice raw. She reached out a trembling hand, not for the cloth, but hovering near his arm, seeking an anchor. He didn't pull away. A sudden heavy thump against the cabin door made them both jump. Not the wind, something solid, a rock, a boot. Silas's hand flew to the Colt at his hip. His body instantly coiled back towards the threat. He peered through the small cleared patch on the ice-rimed window. The swirling snow revealed nothing but white fury. No shapes, no movement near the door. But the message was clear. They knew they were being watched. They were testing, taunting. Alara whimpered, drawing her knees up slightly, fear etching new lines on her face. "Judd," she breathed. "That's his way. Likes to scare first." Silas kept his eyes on the window, his knuckles white on the Colt's grip. "Save your breath," he said, his voice low and hard. "Focus on the baby." The word felt strange, dangerous. He turned back towards her, forcing his attention away from the unseen menace. He dipped the cloth again, the warm water steaming faintly. Awkwardly, he wiped the sweat from her brow. Her skin was clammy. She flinched at his touch at first, then relaxed minutely, a small sigh escaping her. "Caleb," she started, her voice thin, interrupted by the gathering pressure of another contraction. She wrote it silently this time, teeth gritted, her hand gripping the edge of the cot until her knuckles turned bone white. When it passed, she looked exhausted, haunted. He owns half of Pine Hollow. The mine, the saloon. Men like Judd, they're his dogs. He tells them to fetch, they fetch, tells them to bite. She trailed off, a tremor running through her. He doesn't lose, not ever, not even his wife, especially not his property. The word property dripped with bitterness and fear. Silas felt a cold rage, different from the battlefield fury he knew. This was calculated, personal evil. He thought of Martha, her gentle spirit, her quiet strength, the helplessness he'd felt watching the fever take her and Ben. He wouldn't fail again. He couldn't. He rummaged in a small trunk near his cot, pushing aside spare cartridges and worn leather, searching for something, anything clean. His fingers brushed cold metal. He pulled out a small tarnished silver locket on a broken chain, forgotten for years. Martha's. He'd shoved it away, unable to bear its silent accusation. He stared at it for a second, the smooth metal cool against his calloused palm, a relic of a life drowned in grief. He shoved it into his pocket, a strange, heavy weight against his thigh. He found a folded piece of soft, worn flannel, an old shirt perhaps, and thrust it towards Alara. "Here, for later." She took it, her fingers brushing his. Her touch was startlingly warm. "You had a family?" she asked softly, her eyes on the flannel, avoiding his gaze. The question was a knife twist. The image flashed. Ben's small still face, Martha's vacant eyes staring past him in the infirmary bed. The smell of carbolic acid and death, the crushing weight of after. He turned abruptly back to the stove, pretending to adjust the fire. "Gone," he rasped, the single word closing the door on that memory tighter than any bar. "Long time gone." Silence descended, thick and heavy, broken only by Alara's increasingly labored breathing, and the relentless assault of the storm. Silas paced the small space, a caged predator. He checked the window again, nothing. Checked the door bar, solid. Checked the Winchester, loaded. He felt the weight of the locket in his pocket, a ghostly presence. He touched it briefly, the cold metal a tangible link to a past failure that shadowed this present, desperate stand. Another contraction seized Alara, stronger, longer. A low cry escaped her, muffled against the flannel she'd pressed to her mouth. Silas was at her side instantly, the external threat momentarily forgotten. "Breathe," he urged again, his voice rough but less hesitant. "Blow it out." He placed a hand, large and awkward, on her shoulder. She didn't shrug it off. She leaned into the pressure, focusing on his voice, on the rhythm he tried to impose on the chaos inside her. "Hurts," she gasped when it eased, tears leaking from the corners of her eyes. "So much." "I know," Silas murmured, surprising himself. He did know pain, physical, soul deep. He dipped the cloth again, wiping her face. A fragile strand of connection hummed between them, woven from shared danger, shared vulnerability, the terrifying precipice of new life, amidst so much potential for death. Suddenly, Alara stiffened, not with pain, with dawning, absolute terror. Her eyes, wide and fixed on the shuttered window, reflected not just fear, but recognition. "Silas," she whispered, her voice cracking with pure dread. He whirled, following her gaze. Through the swirling snow, visible only because of the firelight leaking through the shutter slats, a pinpoint of orange light flared in the white chaos. Not near the barn, closer, much closer, near the edge of the lean-to, perhaps 20 paces from the cabin door. A match, held steady for a deliberate second before being extinguished. A signal, a marker. They weren't just waiting, they were positioning, preparing. Before Silas could react, before he could even form a thought, Alara gasped again. But this sound was different, wetter, more final. Her eyes widened further, not with fear of the men outside, but with the shocking, undeniable reality within. She looked down at the soaked blanket beneath her, then back up at Silas, her face a mask of shock and escalating panic. "Silas," her voice was a ragged thread. "My water," it broke. The words "my water." It broke hung in the air, a declaration of life's unstoppable force colliding violently with the pinprick of light that had just marked death's approach. Elara's face was a mask of shock and escalating terror, her body caught between the primal drive of labor and the paralyzing fear of the men outside. Silas felt the cabin walls close in, the storm's howl a frantic counterpoint to the sudden, wet reality, soaking the blanket beneath her. Instinct roared louder than fear. The signal flare meant positioning. Likely for a rush. They had minutes, maybe seconds. He grabbed the Winchester from the corner, his movements fluid and deadly calm, the battlefield focus snapping into place. He thrust the Colt Peacemaker, loaded cylinder ready, towards Elara. "Bar the door behind me," he barked, the command cutting through her panic. "Use this only if they get in." He didn't wait for acknowledgement. He yanked the heavy wooden bar free, flung the door open into the blinding fury of the storm, and plunged out, slamming it shut behind him. He heard the heavy thunk of the bar dropping home a heartbeat later. The cold was a physical assault, the wind-driven snow like shards of glass. He dropped low, using the cabin wall for cover, squinting against the white chaos. The flare had been near the lean-to. Movement, a bulky shadow detaching itself from the woodpile, maybe 15 paces away, rifle raised. Silas didn't hesitate. The Winchester spoke, a sharp, flat crack swallowed instantly by the storm's roar. The shadow jerked, cried out, and stumbled back, disappearing into the swirling white. One down. Silas didn't wait to see. He scrambled along the cabin wall, away from the lean-to, towards the corner facing the barn. He pressed himself flat against the logs, heart hammering against his ribs, breath pluming in ragged gasps. He could hear shouting now, muffled but furious, coming from the barn direction. "Ricker," he got Sims. A deeper voice bellowed back. "Flank the damn cabin, now." They were moving. He had to get back inside. Elara was alone, defenseless, in the throes of labor. The image of Martha, alone and dying in that Memphis infirmary, flooded him. The helplessness, the crushing guilt. No, not again. He pushed off the wall, sprinting low towards the door. A shot rang out from near the barn, the bullet whining off a stone in the foundation near his feet. He threw himself the last few feet, pounding on the door. "Elara, open." The bar scraped. The door opened a crack, revealing Elara's terrified face. He shoved through, slamming it shut and dropping the bar with a final, resonant thud. He leaned against it, gasping, snow melting in rivulets down his face. Inside, the air was thick with heat, wood smoke, and a new metallic scent. Elara was back on the cot, writhing, a guttural moan tearing from her throat. Her face was contorted, slick with sweat and tears. "Silas, it's coming now." Her voice was a ragged scream. The war outside faded. There was only this woman, this life fighting to emerge. He dropped the Winchester, shrugged off his snow-caked coat, and moved to the stove, plunging his hands into the pot of now scalding water. He scrubbed furiously with the cloth, the sting grounding him. He grabbed the clean flannel he'd given her earlier. "Push, Elara," he commanded, his voice rough but steady, kneeling beside the cot. He recalled the midwife's urgent tone. "When it comes, push with everything," she screamed, a raw animal sound, her body arching off the thin mattress, her hands scrabbled for purchase on the rough wood frame. Silas braced her leg, his other hand ready, his mind a terrifying blank slate, except for the immediate, visceral need. He saw the crown, dark and slick with blood and fluid. The world narrowed to this small bloodied patch of blanket. "Again," he urged. "Push." Elara bore down with a primal strength that seemed to shake the cabin. A guttural cry, part agony, part triumph, ripped from her. And then, with a final, shuddering effort, the tiny slippery body slid into Silas's waiting hands. Time stopped. a small wrinkled face, minuscule fists clenched, a pause that stretched into eternity. Then, a thin, indignant wail pierced the cabin's tense air. Life, loud, protesting, miraculous life. Silas stared, stunned, the tiny squirming body warm and vital in his large, calloused hands. The sound, that fierce, demanding cry, shattered something inside him. A frozen wall he hadn't known was still standing. Tears, hot and unexpected, blurred his vision. Ben, he hadn't heard Ben cry, not once. He cradled the newborn, a boy, wiping mucus from his nose and mouth with the clean corner of the flannel, his movements clumsy but infinitely gentle. Elara gasped, collapsing back, utterly spent, tears streaming down her face. "Is he?" she whispered, her voice a thread. "He's here," Silas rasped, the words thick with emotion he couldn't name. He wrapped the tiny form in the flannel, a makeshift swaddle, and carefully placed the wriggling bundle onto Elara's chest. Her arms came around the baby instinctively, pulling him close, her sobs mingling with the infant's cries. She looked down, wonder momentarily, eclipsing the exhaustion and fear. Oh, my boy." Outside, the storm raged, shouting echoed, "Closer now. Ricker, they're barricaded. Sims is bleedin' bad." A furious roar answered, "Burn 'em out, smoke the rats." The fragile moment shattered, "Burn them out." In this tinderbox cabin, Silas's blood ran cold. He saw the flicker of terror return to Elara's eyes as she clutched her son. He moved swiftly, he grabbed the knife from his belt, cutting the cord with a decisive slice, tying it off with a length of twine he found nearby, practical, necessary. He covered Elara and the baby with the blanket and his discarded buffalo hide coat. "Stay down," he ordered, his voice steel again. He snatched up the Winchester and moved to the window, rubbing a larger patch clear. He saw figures moving in the swirling snow, two dark shapes near the lean-to, one bent over a third on the ground. Judd Ricker, a massive silhouette, was gesturing wildly towards the cabin, pointing towards the roof. Silas knew what they intended: fire arrows, or torches tossed onto the sod roof, dry beneath the snow. Once it caught, he chambered around, the metallic snick loud in the sudden quiet inside the cabin. Elara had started humming again, faint and tremulous, the melody of Lorena, weaving through the baby's cries and the rising wind, a fragile thread of defiance. The sun's low down the sky. Lorena, Ricker moved towards the woodpile, likely searching for kindling. He was exposed, silhouetted against the whiteness. Silas raised the Winchester, resting the barrel on the window ledge. The sights settled on the center of Ricker's broad back. The sharpshooter's calm descended. Distance 30 yards. Wind, fierce, left to right. Adjust, hold steady, breathe out, squeeze. The rifle bucked. The sharp report was swallowed by the gale, but the effect was immediate. Ricker jerked violently, stumbled forward, and crashed face first into the snowdrift beside the woodpile. He didn't move. The other man near the lean-to froze, staring at Ricker's still form, then at the cabin window. He saw Silas's shadowed figure, the rifle barrel. Panic seized him. He grabbed the groaning Sims, hauling him up, and began staggering frantically back towards the barn, abandoning their fallen leader. Silas tracked them for a moment, finger on the trigger, then lowered the rifle. Let them run. Let them carry the message back to Caleb Bishop. He watched until the two figures vanished into the white maelstrom, dragging Ricker's body towards the barn. The immediate threat was over. For now, he turned back to the cabin. Elara lay still, the baby quiet now, nestled against her, suckling weakly. Her eyes were closed, exhaustion etched deep, but a profound peace softened her features. The firelight danced on her sweat-dampened hair, on the tiny perfect face of the infant. The haunting strains of Lorena had faded into her soft rhythmic breathing. Silas sank onto the stool near the cot, the Winchester resting across his knees. The adrenaline ebbed, leaving him hollow and trembling. He looked at Elara and the child, then around the small scarred cabin, his refuge, his prison. He reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around the cold metal of Martha's locket. He pulled it out, the tarnished silver catching the firelight. He looked at it for a long moment, the ghost of a smile touching his lips, a sad, weary thing, but genuine. He leaned forward, and gently tucked the locket into the folds of the flannel swaddle, near the baby's tiny hand, a gift, a blessing, a letting go. Outside, the blizzard continued its relentless siege, howling around the little cabin like a thwarted beast. Inside, the fire crackled, warming the air that smelled now of wood smoke, blood, new life, and a fragile hard-won peace. Silas Grant, the solitary rancher, watched over the sleeping mother and child, the ghosts of his past momentarily stilled by the fierce breathing reality of the present. The storm would pass. Pine Hollow and Caleb Bishop were still out there, but for this night, in this small circle of firelight, they were safe. He leaned his head back against the log wall, listening to the wind and the soft rhythmic breathing, keeping watch as the long Montana night wore on.